Hi everyone, so we're on the next instalment of the Ickabog. I hope you've all had a lovely weekend. You'll have an activity based on Purple Mash based on the next two chapters. So chapter 3, Death of a Seamstress. The Beamish and Dovetail families both lived in a place called the City within the City. This was the part of Shoeville where all the people who worked for King Fred had houses. Gardeners, cooks, tailors, page boys, seamstresses, stonemasons, grooms, carpenters, footmen and maids, all of them occupied neat little cottages just outside the palace grounds. The city within the city was separate from the rest of Shoeville by a high white wall, and the gates in the wall stood open during the day so the residents could visit friends and family in the rest of Shoeville and go to the markets. By night the sturdy gates were closed and everyone in the city within the city slept, like the king, under the protection of the royal guard. Major Beamish, Bert's father, was head of the royal guard, a handsome, cheerful man who rode a steel grey horse. He accompanied King Fred, Lord Spittleworth, and Lord Flapoon on their hunting trips, which usually happened 5 times a week. The king liked Major Beamish, and he also liked Bert's mother, because Bertha Beamish was the king's own private pastry chef, a high honour in that city of world-class bakers. Due to Bertha's habits of bringing home fancy cakes that hadn't turned out absolutely perfect, Bert was a plump little boy, and sometimes, I regret to say, the other children called him Butterball and made him cry. Bert's best friend was Daisy Dovetail. The two children had been born days apart and acted more like brother and sister than playmates. Daisy was Bert's defender against bullies. She was skinny but fast and more than ready to fight anyone who called Bert Butterball. Daisy's father, Dan Dovetail, was the king's carpenter, repairing and replacing the wheels and shafts on his carriages. As Mr. Dovetail was so clever at carving, he also made bits of furniture for the palace. Daisy's mother, Dora Dovetail, was her head seamstress of the palace, another honoured job, because King Fred liked clothes and kept a whole team of tailors busy making him new costumes every month. It was the king's great fondness for finery that led to a nasty incident which the history books of cornucopia would later record as the beginning of all the troubles that were to engulf that happy little kingdom. At the time it happened, only a few people within the city knew anything about it, though for some it was an awful tragedy. What happened was this. The king of Pluritania came to pay a formal visit to Fred, still hoping perhaps to exchange one of his daughters for a lifetime supply of hopes of heaven, and Fred decided that he must have a brand new set of clothes made for the occasion, dull purple overlaid with silver lace, with amethyst buttons and grey fur at the cuffs. Now, King Fred had heard something about the head seamstress not being quite well, but he hadn't paid much attention. He didn't trust anyone but Daisy's mother to stitch on the silver lace properly, so gave the order that nobody else should be given the job. In consequence, Daisy's mother sat up 3 nights in a row, racing to finish the purple suit in time for the King of Pluritania's visit, and at dawn on the 4th day, her assistant found her lying on the floor, dead, with the very last amethyst button in her hand. The king's chief adviser came to break the news while Fred was still having his breakfast. The chief adviser was a wise old man called Herringbone, with a silver beard that hung almost to his knees. After explaining that the head seamstress had died, he said, "But I'm sure one of you other ladies will be able to fix on the last button for your majesty." There was a look in Herringbone's eye that King Fred didn't like. It gave him a squirling feeling in the pit of his stomach. While his dresses were helping him into his new purple suit later that morning, Fred tried to make himself feel less guilty by talking the matter over with Lord Spittleworth and Flapoon. "I mean to say, if I'd known she was seriously ill," panted Fred, as the servants heaved him into his skin-tight satin pantaloons, "naturally I'd have let someone else sew the suit." "Your Majesty is so kind," said Spittleworth, as he examined his sallow complexion in the mirror over the fireplace. "A more tender-hearted monarch was never born." "The woman should have spoken up if she felt unwell," grunted Flapoon from a cushioned seat by the window. If she's not fit to work, she should have said so. Properly looked at, that's disloyalty to the king, or to your suit, anyway." "Flapoon's right," said Spittleworth, turning away from the mirror. "Nobody could treat his servants better than you do, sire." "I do treat them well, don't I?" said King Fred anxiously, sucking in his stomach as the dresses did up his amethyst buttons. "After all, chaps, I've got to look my blasted best today, haven't I? You know how dressy the King of Pluritania always is." It would be a matter of national shame if you were any less well dressed than the King of Pluritania," said Spittleworth. "Put this unhappy occurrence out of your mind, sir," said Flipoon. "A disloyal seamstress is no reason to spoil a sunny day." And yet, in spite of the two lords' advice, King Fred couldn't be quite easy in his mind. Perhaps he was imagining it, but he thought Lady Islanda looked particularly serious that day. The servants' smiles seemed colder, and the maids' curtsies a little less deep. As his court feasted that evening with the King of Puritania, Fred's thoughts kept drifting back to the seamstress, dead on the floor, with the last amethyst button clutched in her hand. Before Fred went to bed that night, Herringbone knocked on his bedroom door. After deeply bowing, the chief adviser asked whether the king was intending to send flowers to Mrs. Dovedale's funeral. Oh, yes," said Fred, startled. "Yes, send a big wreath, saying how sorry I am and so forth. You can arrange that, can't you, Herringbone?" "Certainly, sire," said the chief adviser. "And if I may ask, are you planning to visit the seamstress's family at all? They live, just a short distance from the palace gates." "Visit them?" said the king pensively. "Oh, no, Herringbone, I don't think I'd like. I mean to say, I'm sure they aren't expecting that." Herringbone and the king looked at each other for a few seconds. Then the chief adviser bowed and left the room. Now, as King Fred was so used to everyone telling him what a marvellous chap he was, he really didn't like the frown with which the chief adviser had left. He now began to feel cross rather than ashamed. "It's a bally pity," he told his reflection, turning back to the mirror in which he had been combing his moustaches before bed. "But after all, I'm the king and she was a seamstress. If I died, I wouldn't have expected her to." But then it occurred to him, if he died, he'd expect the whole of Cornucopia to stop whatever they were doing and dress all in black and weep for a week, just as they'd done for his father, Richard the Righteous. "Well, anyway," he said impatiently to his reflection, "life goes on." He put on his silk nightcap, climbed into his four-poster bed, blew out his candle, and fell asleep. So let's see what happens in the next one. Chapter 4, The Quiet House. Mrs. Dovedale was buried in the graveyard in the city within the city, where generations of royal servants lay. Daisy and her father stood hand in hand, looking down at the grave for a long time. Bert kept looking back at Daisy as his tearful mother and grim-faced father led him slowly away. Bert wanted to say something to his best friend, but what had happened was too enormous and dreadful for words. Bert could hardly bear to imagine how he'd feel if his mother had disappeared forever into the cold, hard earth. When all their friends had gone, Mr. Dovedale moved the purple wreath sent by the king away from Mrs. Dovedale's headstone and put in its place the small bunch of snowdrops that Daisy had collected that morning. Then the two Dovedales walked slowly home to a house they knew would never be the same again. A week after the funeral, the king rode out of the palace with the royal car to go hunting. As usual, everyone along his route came rushing out into their gardens to bow, curtsy and cheer. As the king bowed and waved back, he noticed that the front garden of one cottage remained empty. It had black drapes in the windows and the front door. "Who lives there?" he asked Major Beamish. That's the Dovedale house, Your Majesty," said Beamish. Dovedale, said the king, frowning. "I've heard that name, haven't I?" Yes, sir," said Major Beamish. "Mr. Dovedale is Your Majesty's carpenter, and Mrs. Dovedale was Your Majesty's head seamstress." "Ah, yes," said King Fred hurriedly. I remember." And spurring his milk-white charger into a canter, he rode swiftly past the black-draped windows of the Dovedale cottage, trying to think of nothing but the day's hunting that lay ahead. But every time the king rode out after that, he couldn't help but fix his eyes on the empty garden and the black-draped door of the Dovedale residence, and every time he saw the cottage, the image of the dead seamstress clutching that amethyst button came back to him. Finally, he could bear it no longer and summoned the chief adviser to him. "Herringbone," he said, not looking at the old man in the eye, "there's a house on the corner on the way to the park, rather a nice cottage, largish garden." "The Dovedale house, Your Majesty." "Oh, that's who lives there, is it?" said Fred airily. "Well, it occurs to me that it's a rather big place for a small family. I think I've heard there are only 2 of them. Is that correct?" "Perfectly correct, Your Majesty. Just 2 since the mother—" "It doesn't really seem fair, Herringbone," King Fred said loudly, "for that nice spacious cottage to be given to only 2 people when there are families of 5 or 6, I believe, who'd be happy with a little more room." "You'd like me to move the Dovetails, Your Majesty?" "Yes, I think so," said Fred, pretending to be very interested in the tip of his satin shoe. "Very well, Your Majesty," said the chief adviser with a bow. I shall ask them to swap with the Roach's family, whom I'm sure would be glad of more space, and I shall put the dovetails in the Roach's house." "And where is that?" asked the king, nervously, for the last thing he wanted was to see those black drapes even nearer the palace gates. "Right on the edge of the city within the city," said the chief adviser, "very close to the graveyard "That sounds suitable," interrupted King Fred, leaping to his feet. "I have no need of details. Just make it happen, Herringbone. There's a good chap." And so Daisy and her father were instructed to swap houses with the family of Captain Roach, who, like Bert's father, was a member of the King's Royal Guard. The next time King Fred rode out, the black drapes had vanished from the door, and the Roach children, 4 strapping brothers, with the one who'd first christened Bert Beamish Butterball, came running into the front garden and jumped up and down, cheering and waving cornucopian flags. King Fred beamed and waved back at the boys. Weeks passed, and King Fred forgot all about the dovetails and was happy again. Well, King Fred sounds like an interesting character. So there's going to be a quiz on Purple Mash for you. Have a go at that, and then tomorrow we'll read the next 2 chapters and see how we get on with the story and whether or not King Fred continues to be happy.